Well, for those of you who are math people, I have a video for you today. I know we've been devoting quite a bit of time to literacy, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time on math now. This week we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how to best teach math and what some options are for getting more out of your students when you're running a math lesson. Well, hello, I'm Courtney. Welcome to my channel where we discuss educational research one study at a time so that you can incorporate it into your practice. I'll be honest, not really a math person, don't love the subject, but I am facing my fears for the benefit of my students, and so I have been really trying to delve into what is the best way to teach math, where do I start, what are some options for me. Now, where I'm from, a big push right now is spiral math, and so I wanted to look more into that. And I can safely say that I have not found all the answers for you yet. I'm hoping to build up to that. I think part of the reason why it's hard for me to find good research about spiral math is that I don't have enough of a foundation of math research yet to know what key terms to be looking for when I'm searching and to know who the big players are in the math world. And so I'm backtracking a little bit and starting with just some information about instructional practice and where to begin with this. If we can't spiral our math, what can we do? Or maybe this is spiral math. I don't know. If you have information after you've watched this video and you think you can help me out, please comment below or contact me directly so that I can get a better grasp of what it is that is taking place in the math world right now. This week's study is a review of literature, and it is called The Effects of Spacing and Mixing Practice Problems. The author in this study is really interested in looking at the differences between blocked practice and mixed review when it comes to math instruction. So in block practice, you teach your lesson, and then the students work on a whole bunch of questions that are about the lesson that you just taught. And in mixed review, you teach your lesson, and then when students practice, they're practicing some of the information that you've just taught them, and then also some information that is from previous lessons that you've taught. So it's all kind of mixed in. And then the author is also exploring the differences in achievement when lessons are spaced out compared to lessons being kind of smushed together. So let's get into it. The research questions that the author is using to guide this study are: with regard to heavy repetition, once students have solved one kind of practice problem on a topic, is there benefit in doing several more of those problems immediately afterward? What is the effect of distributing problems on one topic across multiple practice sets? And when a practice set includes problems on several topics, what is the effect of mixing problems on different topics? Let's talk about heavy repetition first, since that's what the author talks about first. So in heavy repetition, a student is taught a lesson and they practice it and they practice it and they practice it and they practice it. And so the author was really looking at studies that talked about, okay, when do we stop giving them practice? So this repeating practice over and over and over after you've already had your aha moment and you understand what it is referred to as overlearning in the research. I hate that term. Can you ever overlearn? But that's what it's called in the research, is overlearning. And so the author was really looking into at what point have we overlearned enough? Because it is beneficial for students, but at what point is it enough? In one of the studies that the author refers to, college students received a tutorial in math, and then they could practice questions and get real-time feedback on their results. I think they showed an image of what the solution should actually look like, so students could practice, see if they did it, practice, see if they did it. And immediately after the tutorial, students completed either 3 or 9 different practice questions, and when they were tested, the results were negligible. So the students who did 3 practice questions compared to 9, it didn't really make a difference. And so the point that the author is making isn't that it's not good to practice, it's good to practice, it's just it does take time to practice, and so there's an efficiency aspect to teaching that needs to be taken into account. And so if students are getting it and they understand it, they don't necessarily need to do 15 more questions. And the reason why the author is bringing this research to light is because if you're going to do mixed practice or mixed review, which the author talks about later on in the study, then we need to know that that repetition over and over and over isn't seminal to learning, because if students need to practice over and over and over, then obviously mixed review is not going to work for you. So the author first starts by making a case that you can learn something, practice it a few times after you've internalized it and you get how to do it, and then it's okay to move on. The next area that the author focuses on is spacing. So the two terms that the author talks about are spacing and massed when it comes to instruction. So instruction being spaced out or instruction being massed together. And there are robust findings that spacing out instruction is really important for students to internalize information and to remember it. And the author makes a good point that we focus a lot on students acquiring information and the acquisition of information and learning, but we don't focus a lot on forgetting, and we need to, because forgetting is a big part of what can happen in schools. Especially, you see it over the summer. Kids come back in September and they have forgotten a lot of what they've been taught, and we know that they learned it because they were able to show us. We have data, we have report cards, we have all of our stuff to show that they did it, and then they come back in September and sometimes it's like it's brand new for the first time. So what spacing out your instruction does is kind of catches your students before they would forget. So they've learned it, they're thinking about it, they're about to forget, oh, you teach it again a little bit, or you link back to it and they can remember again and again. And so spacing is really important for students. The author shows that there's research about spacing in instruction with regards to biology, foreign language, and math, of course. The author also shows that the positive effects of spacing can last for over a year, which is fantastic because that will get kids through the summer. If we can space out their work enough and our instruction enough that they can internalize it, then we can keep them in the loop until next year rolls around and they have to be confronted with the work again. In one study that the author talks about, which was actually done in 1985, grade 3 students were taught multiplication facts, and some of them were taught in a massed setting and some of them were taught with the instruction being spaced out. And when students were tested immediately after the last lesson, the students who received the spaced out instruction increased their scores by 105%. So that's pretty impressive, I would say. The author also talks about how with spacing, it's pretty easy to do, and it's probably one of the most underutilized strategies for teaching that requires very little effort on our part. So let's take this research out of the context of the academic world and into the context of an actual classroom. If you are a teacher in a classroom where you can have autonomy over your schedule, then absolutely you can space things out. You could even space things out throughout the day, right? Like you could teach half of your math in the morning, half of your math in the afternoon, just to have students have some time to sit with the information and be about to forget it and then bring it back to them. But if you're a teacher who has a classroom where you teach rotary and you only have one subject, you might not be able to space things out quite as much. You might find it to be a little bit more difficult depending on what the rules are of your school, depending on what your schedule is, and depending on how many opportunities you get to see different groups of students in a day. But don't worry, if you teach rotary, all is not lost, because then the author talks about mixed practice or mixed review. And this is where I think we can make up for anything that we miss out on in spacing. So spacing is really focusing on just the timing of your instruction, whereas mixed review is talking about bringing in things that you've taught previously and adding them into the practice that you're giving students. And remember, the author's focusing specifically on math here. That's the scope of this literature review, is math. So with mixed review, one of the benefits is that students can't just figure out what strategy they are going to need to use when it comes to solving a math problem or a procedure. So when you do massed review, so you teach the class a lesson on, I don't know, the invert and multiply rule for fractions, your students know that all of the practice that's going to happen afterwards requires them to invert and multiply. So they don't even really need to be thinking about what strategy it is, because they're practicing the strategy, not deciding if or when a strategy is appropriate. And so the author talks about how detrimental this is to students figuring out word problems, because when they do word problems associated with a lesson that you just taught, they know what the strategy is going to be. They might have to bring in a few other pieces of information, but by and large, a lot of the way that we structure our math lets students just use the strategy that we've taught and not even have to search for what procedure would be most appropriate. It's the one right in front of you. It's lesson 6.1. Look up at the top. Do whatever it says to do in lesson 6.1 and you'll be good. And so the spirit of learning is lost a little bit. It reminds me a little bit of when you're teaching students how to print and they're making the lowercase I. There's always one kid who catches on that, oh, tick, 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 and then dot, 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 dot right across the top, because they know that this is a lot faster, a lot easier. Yeah, you're not really getting the whole, mechanics down of how to make your little lowercase I, and so you're not retaining that information, but you're getting through it quickly. And so with massed practice, that is kind of what can happen a little bit, because students just find the strategy and can just whip right through it. The author looked at a study that involved 9 and 10-year-olds learning about different geometric prisms and different problems that they had to learn with those prisms. So like find the number of edges if you know the number of sides on the base. And half of the students were given mass practice and the other half were given mixed practice. And when it came time to look at test scores, those who engaged in the mixed practice outperformed compared to the unmixed practice, 78% versus 38. And again, that's an impressive outperformance there. So this is really interesting. If we want our students to really learn in a deep way and bring in all of their thinking skills, then all we have to do is mix in some of their practice. So teach a lesson, give them a few practice questions, and then bring in some practice questions from things that we have previously taught them. Oh, but my students were so quiet on test days when they would walk in reciting their formulas in their head over and over and over until I gave them their paper and they frantically wrote it down on their test. I'm gonna miss those days. It's gonna free them up to have conversations during my class. As with any research, there are obviously going to be some limitations, and the ones that exist for mixed practice are definitely worth you sticking around to listen to. One of the first limitations is that a lot of the studies that focused on math were really focused on procedural math, not necessarily those core foundational lessons in math. So this makes me think that perhaps in the primary grades, mixed practice isn't going to be as beneficial, because that's when you're still developing those foundational skills in math. And then in the junior and intermediate and senior grades, I think that would be a more appropriate time to start mixing in the review for students. That's not to say you can't mix it in when students are younger, but they do need a bit more repetition, it sounds like, so that they can understand what those skills are and they can really learn the basics before they start doing things with the basics. Another limitation is that mixed review and massed review haven't necessarily been tested out in great detail in classroom settings. And so we know that the classroom is a whole other ballgame. Just because it's been done in a laboratory doesn't mean it's going to work in a classroom with all of the different variables that a classroom can entail. The author also wants to mention that the whole deciding between should you do massed practice or mixed practice is a bit of a false dichotomy. It's more likely that a hybrid approach would be useful for meeting the needs of all students. It's also important to note that with mixed review, practice performance tends to be lower. Test performance is increased, but practice performance is lower, and that's because students don't necessarily have that momentum going. They haven't gotten into the swing of it when they're practicing because they have to complete a question, find out all of the information they need for that question and what strategies they're going to use, then switch over to another question, think about all the strategies, then switch over, and so they lose the repetition that makes their work go quicker, and they lose that ability to get questions right over and over and over. And so you might find, if you are implementing mixed practice, that the practice part of it isn't as smooth and isn't as inspiring because students aren't as successful in it. But just because they're not good at practice doesn't mean that they're not going to be good on the test. You want them to do poorly in the practice and better on the test, because the practice is where the learning happens. And so it is a bit of a tricky thing to wrap our heads around as educators. We want to just see continued success, whereas mixed practice really does force people to struggle and force students to really deeply learn the content that they're being taught. And then this is something that I'm really glad the author included, because I don't see it in a lot of research, and that is the toll that this takes on a teacher. And so the author, now this is speculative because the author didn't find research to support this, but the author is speculating that from a teaching perspective, they don't need to teach in any different way because it's the same lessons, it's just the homework or the review that you're assigning that's going to be different. But when it comes time to take up those questions the next day, or whenever you take up questions with your students to see how they did, that can be a bit more problematic because you're probably going to have more students who got wrong answers or who struggled with their work. And so the time it takes to get through the homework or the practice work is going to be increased. On the other hand, the author talks about one of the benefits of mixed review is that if a lesson didn't go well, there's going to be other opportunities for students to pick it up. And if a student has missed a day or even a week, they're still going to get other opportunities to practice those skills. So with mixed practice, you'll have fewer students where you're saying, I don't have enough data to know if you know this skill, or the student didn't get enough time to even practice, so it's a lost cause. We've already covered integers and we're never going back. So mixed practice can really be beneficial for those students. And now, because I'm trying to bridge research and practice, there are a few other constraints and limitations that I do want to bring to everybody's attention, because the classroom, like I said, is a totally different place than a laboratory setting. And I think the author did a good job bringing in some of the concerns that teachers might have, but I have a few others as well. One is the constraints that we're all faced by the rules around report card reporting. So depending on where you are, you might have different rules about how much data you have to collect for each report card, how many different domains of math you have to cover. And so if your students haven't had enough opportunities to show you a complete domain because you've been mixing in your practice, that could have an impact on your ability to adopt mixed practice into your teaching. And that brings me to my next point, assessment. I'm not sure how assessment would go with mixed practice, because you would have to somehow code all of the practice work students are doing to see how they're doing it. Maybe with computers, if tests were computerized or something like that, they could be coded ahead of time. But if we're just talking about paper and pencil tasks, I'm not quite sure how you would gather that kind of data to be able to reflect the assessment back to the students and back to all the other stakeholders like your principals and the students' families. I'm hoping that as I gather more research on this topic, I'll be able to answer some of those questions and maybe shed some light on those limitations and see what other people have done. If you include spaced out instruction or mixed reviewing in your math class, would you please do me a favor and put a comment down below so that I can learn from you and so that we can all learn from you, because I think that this topic is fascinating, and I think that if there are ways to do it efficiently and easily, the research is there that shows that it can be really beneficial for our students. Obviously, we need a lot more research on this topic, and research that involves classroom settings and teacher perspectives. I think we always need research that involves teacher perspectives. So I will look into that as I go, and hopefully more research can be done in this field as well. Well, that's all that I have to share with you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this information useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up so that it can reach more people through YouTube, and consider sharing it with a colleague. And I will see you next week for another video. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.